Chapter 10. His mood vacillated from an aching desire to stride right back into his parents' house and show Isabel just how pretty and worthy she was, to wanting to find some way to avenge her feelings after she had been married to that good-for-nothing teacher. Oh, Isabel. It fit her so much better than Izzy. She was a beautiful woman, not some child, and he had let it slip in his weakness. He couldn't think of her as Izzy. She was Isabel, a beautiful, captivating woman. He clenched his fist and strode into the barn. Stan stood against the back wall waiting for him, his hat tilted at an angle that hid his eyes. The only thing visible was the smirk on his lips. "I got the hands like you said. 25 of them." 25? He had asked for 5. "I know I only asked you for 5 men, Stan." The wrangler flicked his toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. "Nope, I distinctly remember you saying 25 ropers at $5 a day." Red-hot fury built behind his eyes. "Are you fixing to get replaced?" Stan spit the toothpick out and lifted his head to stare at him. "I'd like to see you prove I done anything wrong." As Stan sauntered away, Conrad fumed. If he didn't learn to read fast, he'd lose everything, but not before he took care of Stan. Arnold came in, leading Lightning, one of their new geldings. "Arnold, it's time we replaced Stan. I asked him to get feed, and he got flour. I asked him to hire 5 men at $1 a day. He hired 25 at $5. Arnold's eyes went wide. "That's more than the foreman makes. Sakes alive. We'd better find them and weed out a few." "Either way, it won't look good. Men who thought they had work now won't, and men who thought they were going to get rich won't think much of the standard wage now. But the broken Circle O will be bankrupt if we let him keep making these expensive mistakes." Arnold nodded and leaned against the wall of a horse's stall. "I'd say, let's explain to them what happened. Stan did this, so he's got to take the blame for it. We'll keep 6 of the men, 1 to replace Stan and the 5 that we need. We can't do much about the pay. We just can't afford to pay ropers that much." Conrad nodded. "I know I should have been the one to do those jobs. I shouldn't have asked Stan to do it, especially after the flour. I should have known he was up to something." Arnold clapped him on the shoulder. "Being the boss is about delegating the work. Just make sure you have Barton do those jobs from now on. His memory's like a steel trap." He should have, and if he hadn't been so embarrassed, he would have. Soon, he wouldn't have to rely on anyone. Isabel would teach him to read, and he'd be able to go into the lumber yard, the mercantile, or anywhere else, even a bakery, if he had to. Hours later, after going home to change and wash up, he strode into his parents' house, and the aroma that danced over his nose stopped him in his tracks. His ma could cook, he had never questioned that, but nothing had ever come from her kitchen that smelled quite so compelling. Conrad followed the luscious scent back to the kitchen to find Isabel alone, bent over the stove. Though he didn't particularly want her to move, she was struggling with a heavy pot, and he couldn't leave her to get burned. "Let me get that for you." She jumped at the sound of his voice and dropped her apron onto the hot oven door. She shrieked and froze. "Isabel, get that out of the stove." Conrad rushed to her, praying she didn't light herself ablaze, gripped her about the waist, and lifted her away from the stove. Her apron was scorched, but didn't catch. He let her go and pulled the tie-string of the apron, yanking it off, and threw it into the soapy wash bucket where her pans from baking the rolls were soaking. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. Conrad grabbed 2 towels and lifted the roasting pans from the oven, closed it, and then faced Isabel. A tear ran down her cheek. He couldn't have that. Raising his voice had been out of fear, not anger. "Now, there's no cause for tears. I'm sorry I scared you. You just look to be having some trouble with the pans." But I burned your ma's apron, and she's likely got 10 more. It isn't the first toasted apron around here, and I doubt it'll be the last." She still quivered on the verge of more tears, and he was out of ideas on how to stop them. He wiped the stray damp trail from her cheek. "Now, is there anything else I can do, or should I just get my carcass out of your kitchen and leave you be?" He smiled, hoping she would too. Isabel touched her hair, even though it wasn't a bit out of place. "I'll be fine. You don't have to stay in here with me. You can go out with your family if you'd like." He chuckled and leaned against the counter. "Well, in that case, I'd like to stay right here. The scenery's rather pretty, and you can't beat the scent." Finally, Isabel laughed, and the tension that had built inside him since he had put his hands around her waist faded away. "I think I've found the poetry book I'd like you to start with. If it doesn't get too late tonight, will you have time?" Ma and Pa entered the kitchen, and Ma made herself busy gathering plates. He didn't want to answer in front of his parents, but couldn't leave her waiting for an answer. "If you're not too tired, I wouldn't mind spending a few extra minutes with you." He prayed she had time. Now that Stan was gone, he'd either have to trust his brothers as Arnold had suggested, or just learn. Once Isabel found out, and he had a mind to tell her that night, she would help him. Never again would he do business without writing it down. "I don't know why you say such things, Conrad." Moretta gave her son a lengthy look. "I think I know why he says such things. Conrad, you should speak to your father later." Her eyebrows rose, and her lip was set into a hard line. It was never a good idea to disagree with Ma. "Yes, ma'am." "Maybe we should even do it now, before we sit down to eat." Pa would tell him to leave Isabel alone, and though he knew he should, he didn't want to. Ma stood and led him from the room, gathering Pa with a slight tilt of her head. After 32 years of marriage, they could talk without speaking. To anyone around them, it was most unnerving. Ma led them out to the paddock and leaned against the railing. He and Pa waited on either side for her to say what was on her mind. Ma would throttle you in a trice if you interrupted her. "Conrad, that girl's only been here but a few days, and I can already see you fussing over her. But fact is, she's a widow. Even if some people are getting away from mourning, her heart isn't ready for another man yet, and you're not ready to take on her grief when it finally hits her, and it will." He knew it. She had to forget her first husband before there would ever be room for him. But that didn't mean he couldn't get close to her while she healed. She had even mentioned Harlan when they had been out on their walk. She wasn't close to ready. "We aren't courting, Ma." Though, if Isabel would. "It isn't that I don't think she's a good girl for you, dear. She's a fine woman. Just don't rush her too fast. She will break." She was already broken, deeply, by that excuse of a man. "How long? I'm 31 years old. My youngest brother is already married and having children. I don't know how I know, but she's just—" His parents had always given sound advice, but even after only a few days, he thought about her all day, wanted to end work quickly so he could go see her. He wasn't getting any younger. His pa finished his sentence better than he could have. "Perfect." Conrad dipped his head. "How long, Pa?" "Only she knows that. When she's able to share with you what happened. When she can laugh again, then she'll be ready." Lula came out the front door and waved to them to let them know dinner was ready. After their meal, he'd get to spend a few minutes with Isabel if she was willing. That was an even better prospect than sweet rolls. But he couldn't court her. His parents were right. She would never love him without first healing from what her husband had done. And though Conrad didn't know exactly, her husband had done her bad. How he wished he could throttle that man.